All right, well, ooh, that's loud. We'll go ahead and get started. I'd like to welcome everyone to our second event in the Bruce J. Nelson Speaker Series this academic year. Climate Storytellers is our theme, and we're featuring Dr. Katharine Hayhoe tonight. My name is Lilia Hawkins. I'm the director of the Hickson Center for Climate and the Environment, and tonight's event is co-sponsored with the Hickson Center and our Hickson Riggs Program for Responsive Science with Vivian Hamilton, who's the director. So it's been an absolute pleasure to spend today with Dr. Hayhoe, someone I have admired closely for a number of years. As an atmospheric chemist and a climate scientist, one of the hardest things that I've had to learn is how to talk about climate change in a way that considers the perspective of the person I'm talking to, and yet also stays true to the causes and urgency of our changing climate. Dr. Hayhoe has been one of my most important teachers in this subject, and her work is a perfect example of how to leverage the power of storytelling and the knowledge of a discipline to communicate broadly and effectively about many dimensions of the climate challenge. Before I further introduce her, I'd like to acknowledge the generosity of the family of the late Bruce J. Nelson, class of 1974, for establishing this educational series to honor Bruce's memory. Bruce died unexpectedly in 1999, though not before having a tremendous impact on the many people whose lives he touched as an unconventional, eclectic, and irrepressible free spirit. He graduated from Harvey Mudd as an independent program of studies major and later earned his master's in computer science from Stanford and his PhD in computer science from Carnegie Mellon. At the time of his death, he was the chief science officer of Cisco Systems. We are honored and grateful to the Nelson family for the opportunity we have each year to host exceptional speakers who are at the forefront of their respective fields. With that acknowledgement, I would like to now introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Katharine Hayhoe. Professor Hayhoe is an accomplished atmospheric scientist who studies climate change and why it matters to us here and now. She's also a remarkable communicator who has received prizes from the American Geophysical Union and the United Nations. She has served as lead author on multiple national climate assessments, and she also hosts and produces the PBS digital series, Global Weirding. She has been named one of Time Magazine's most 100 influential people, and her TED Talk has nearly 4 million views, and her most recent book, Saving Us, A Climate Scientist's Case for Hope and Healing in a Divided World, is available for purchase outside. Professor Hayhoe now serves as Chief Scientist for the Nature Conservancy, and she's a professor in public policy and public law at Texas Tech. So without taking 1 second more from Dr. Hayhoe, I'd like to formally welcome her to Harvey Mudd College.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. I'm so glad to be here with you today in person and also virtually. There's a lot of people listening online right now as well. This is going to be recorded too to share later. But if you're watching the recording, you're not going to be able to participate in all the interactions we have. So if you don't mind, I would like to invite you to take out your cell phones. Now, you can turn the ringer off while you take them out if you forgot. But take out your cell phone, open up the camera app, and click on the link that QR code gives you. Now, if you can't do QR codes, you can type it in. You're going to have to type in POLLEV.com/Katharine, and it's going to be a bit of a trick because you have to spell Katharine right. It's got 2 A's in it. So once you've done that, and if you're listening online, you can do this too. This is the great part. Online or in person doesn't matter. Both types of people can do it. Once you've done that, anybody still waiting? A few people? Leave it up for 1 more second here. Okay. Once you've done that, I want to go ahead and ask you a question. And if you still need the info, you can see at the top, it says POLLEV.com/Katharine. So you can go there anytime. And I want to ask you a question. And no surprise, the students got here first. That's what always happens. There's a strong age correlation between who gets to answer this question first. So are you a student at Harvey Mudd? Are you a student at another Claremont college? Are you faculty or staff? Are you alumni? Are you a community member? Or are you other? And again, if you weren't able to get to the website, the address is right there at the top, POLLEV.com/Katharine. Katharine. You want to do that because we're going to be doing a few of these as we go along, and then at the end, this is how you can ask me questions. Now, if you don't have your phone with you, it's okay. I'm sure there's a very nice person sitting beside you who does. So don't be shy when we get to the question part. If you have a question and you don't have a phone with you, go ahead and ask the person you're talking to. Or, of course, if you're on your computer, you can just do this on your computer as well. All right, so this was the easy question. Now I'm going to ask you a harder question. And before we get to the harder question, I have to warn you, you have to answer the harder question with one word. Any word, but only one word, not two words. Just one word. Ready? We're talking about climate change tonight, so I want to know, you live in California. How have you personally witnessed how climate change is impacting what? Okay, fine. I took off the language filter I usually leave on for middle school students. Clearly, I shouldn't have done that. When you speak to middle school, you have to have a pretty hefty filter on. But you're fast. We've got a lot of words in here. So you have seen how climate change is affecting your water, and you should have. California's been in record drought now for years. Your weather, drought, health, communities, wildfire, smoke, wine. I actually did a study on how climate change is affecting Cabernet Sauvignon. The study involved no tastings whatsoever. I was like, how can that be valid? Ocean, your mood, that's a good one. Your emotions, your fears, your imagination, your ecosystem. Snow's a big one. Somebody say beer in here? Because yes, beer is being affected as well. Yep. Wildfires, plants, farmlands, glaciers, desert, brush fires, tides. Wow, you really have this. Everybody's seen some way that climate change is affecting us. Dogs. Beaches, definitely. All right, so you can keep your phone with you because as we go along, I'll be asking you the odd question here or there. And at the very end, you get to ask me questions like this. But I want to start at the beginning. And the beginning is that we are conducting an unprecedented experiment with the only home we have. As far back as we can go in the paleoclimate record, millions of years in the past, we've never seen this much carbon going into the atmosphere this quickly. Yes, it has been warmer before, long before there were humans on the planet, but the rate of change, we have never seen it changing this quickly. In fact, the closest analog is 55 million years ago, and it's estimated at that time 10% of the carbon was going into the atmosphere on an annual basis that we humans are putting in. That's a radical difference. So how do you tell the story of carbon throughout the Earth's history, flowing into the atmosphere and back into the ocean through the lithosphere, the geology, and the rocks, and back up? How do you tell that story and then tell what's happening today? Because this is a storytelling session, right? Well, I just participated this past year in a really interesting documentary called The Unauthorized Biography of Carbon. And it turns out that's exactly what it does. It tells the story of carbon. In fact, it names carbon as a she. It animates carbon and talks about the flow of carbon through the Earth's climate system and its geological system for millions of years up until the present day. And it is fascinating. So can you tell a story about the unprecedented experiment we're conducting with our planet just from the perspective of carbon? The answer is yes, you can. If any of these things sound really interesting, feel free to take a picture. You don't have to rely on your memory. You have your phone right there. But then we know that a couple hundred years ago, we humans intervened in the story of carbon. How? Through digging up and burning massive amounts of coal and gas and oil that produce heat-trapping gases that are building up in the atmosphere, and as they build up in the atmosphere, they are wrapping an extra blanket around the planet. And just like you would if someone snuck into your room and put an extra heavy blanket over you in the middle of the night, you'd wake up sweating saying, hey, I didn't need this blanket, I'm too hot. That's what's happening to our planet. We are wrapping an extra blanket around the planet, and that is why the planet is warming up. How long have we known this for? Some people would say, well, only since Al Gore did that movie. No, We've known this for a really long time. It was Joseph Fourier in the 1820s, and these are the real images of these people. It's not like when you get your family together and you dress up in the old-timey outfits and then they take like a black and white picture. That's not what this is. This is a real thing. Joseph Fourier in the 1820s, he's the one who figured out that our planet should be a frozen ball of ice, and the only reason it isn't is because we have a natural blanket of heat-trapping gases. But then John Tyndall in the 1850s figured out that we humans, he was studying coal mining, we humans are adding to that extra blanket. And then Eunice Foote, who we do not have a photograph of, I actually went on Ancestry.com and tracked down her family and actually asked them if they had a photograph, but they couldn't find one, unfortunately. Eunice Foote, doing experiments in her backyard in upstate New York, she calculated how much warmer the planet would be if we increased levels of CO2 in the atmosphere. Doing experiments back in the 1850s, and she published a work in 1856. Svante Arrhenius was a physical chemist in Sweden in the 1890s, and in between his day job, which was winning a Nobel Prize in physical chemistry, on the weekends he decided he was going to use the physics and chemistry he knew in the 1890s to calculate by hand the very first climate model. He calculated how much the world would warm by latitude band, because the Arctic warms a lot more than the mid-latitudes, if we increase carbon dioxide in the atmosphere by 50% or 100% or 150% or 200%, and the numbers he got were almost identical to our most powerful supercomputers today. Now, with Arrhenius, it took him 2 years to calculate this by hand. And after the first year, when Christmas rolled around again, his wife packed up the family and left. I take that a bit personally because I'm a climate modeler myself. But what we do these days is you set up your runs, and then you go have dinner with your family, and then you go back and you check them. And, being Swedish, his mother had a surname you may recognize. His mother was a Thunberg. He is indeed a distant cousin of Greta Thunberg today. And then lastly, you can see how there's stories involved here, right? Lastly, there's Guy Callender, who was born in Canada, but went back to Britain when he was 4 years old and became an engineer, and he did secret wartime research for the UK. But in between doing the secret wartime research, he rode around the world and collected thermometer temperature data from weather stations around the world. And he calculated global average temperature for the very first time. Those of you who are in the impact class, we actually had an activity on that this morning. Well, Guy Callender was the first person to do it. And he showed how from 1850 to 1930, the planet was warming. And in 1937, he wrote a paper, which is really interesting to read, and essentially says, you're not going to believe what I have to say, but I will show you that the average temperature of the planet is increasing because of burning fossil fuels. In 1937. So you can see there's a lot of rich stories to tell with these people's work. And there is, in fact, a movie of one of them. There is a movie about Eunice Foote. Educated at one of the only girls' schools in the entire country with a chemistry research lab in the early 1800s, she was a scientist. And her husband was a judge, but he also liked to do scientific investigations, and he was a member of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. And so because he was a member, spouses got grandfathered in. And Eunice presented her work in 1856 at the annual meeting of the AAAS, which I still attend today. And that was the work in which she presented the results of the analysis she did with different levels of CO2 in glass tubes, calculating how much CO2 would warm the planet. That's pretty cool, isn't it? This is just a little short 12-minute movie that you can watch on YouTube. So then, in the days of Arrhenius, he thought it would take thousands of years to double and triple levels of CO2 in the atmosphere. Why? Because he assumed, where was Arrhenius again? Remember, he was back in the 1890s? He assumed that carbon emissions would increase linearly. Did they? No. They increased exponentially. And so, rather than thousands of years, we're looking at decades for these increases that Arrhenius studied. So now we enter the next phase of the story. And this phase of the story is when we realize, whoa, there is something serious going on now. It's not happening in 2200 or 2020. It's not happening in, how would you even say it? 2200? Yes. It's not happening in 2200. It's not happening in 2300. It's happening now. These are the emissions up until the mid-70s. And you can see something is definitely happening. 75% of these emissions were coming from burning coal, oil, and gas. 25% were coming from deforestation and large-scale industrial agriculture. So at that time, in the 1970s, climate scientists had already figured out how to use computers. We've been using computers to create climate models since the 1950s. And in fact, two of the scientists who won the Nobel Prize for Physics 2 years ago were climate scientists from the 1950s who ran the first general circulation model of the atmosphere on computers so old that you had to feed punch cards into them. By the 1970s, you didn't have to feed punch cards in, and scientists were already tracking what Guy Callendar had first calculated back in the 1930s, which is observed global temperature. That's the red line. And they were already calculating what the temperature increase would be in the future, depending on what? Depending on how much carbon we produced. So in the 1970s, scientists were already developing climate models to look at the impact of human activity on our planet. And the results that I'm showing you here today are from scientists who worked for, scientists who worked for Exxon. My colleague Jess Supran just published a paper a couple of weeks ago where they went into Exxon's archives and they found the climate modeling that Exxon was doing in the 1970s. And they found email exchanges that clearly indicated that they knew that burning fossil fuels could lead to global warming with, and this is a direct quote from them, dramatic environmental effects before the year 2050. Now, back at that time in the 70s, if you looked at the list of Fortune 500 companies, which ranks companies by which are the richest, this is what the list looked like. Do you see number one? For those of you at the back, I will read you number one just in case the font is too small. Number one is ExxonMobil. So ExxonMobil, and then guess what? Number three is Mobil. So, combine Mobil and ExxonMobil. Then you've also got Texaco, then you've got Chevron Texaco, you've got Gulf Oil, and you've got Amoco there. Plus, you also have companies that make things that burn fossil fuels. Like what? Like General Motors, like Ford Motor, and then International Business Machines and General Electric were there too. And by the way, it's shown that Ford also had scientists doing similar calculations at the same time. So Exxon and ExxonMobil and Mobil, also Texaco and Chevron Texaco, and Gulf Oil, which was since absorbed, they had a collective choice to make. They knew without a shadow of a doubt that there was potential catastrophic impacts from the products that they were selling people to burn that were producing carbon emissions. Their scientists were telling them this, and they knew it. What could they do? They could do one of two things. A, you could say, well, we have to change our business model as soon as possible. Or you could say, look at those tobacco companies. They really added a couple of decades to their run by hiring spin doctors. And now, actually in the 80s, it looks like their run is coming to an end, thanks to Everett Koop and all of those people back in the 80s who finally showed that smoking caused lung cancer and pushed through legislation to enforce the damages. And so they said, well, there's some people who are out of work who are looking for a job, and they're really good at extending the lifetime of an organization that causes enormous harm but reaps in massive profits. And I'm very sorry to say, they chose option B. And there is a movie about that. It is a very interesting movie called Merchants of Doubt, and actually starts with the tobacco industry, and then it goes into the flame retardants in mattresses industry, which I had no idea about before I read this book. It's a book too, or a movie. And then it goes into climate change. And it tells the story of how experts for hire and spin doctors muddied the waters on climate change to delay action as long as possible to maximize profits. That's quite the story to tell. So here we are in the 1970s. What happened? How successful were they? Let's run this forward to 2021. Very successful. Emissions continue to increase exponentially. What has happened as a result? As a result, 75% of our cumulative carbon emissions, and cumulative is what matters. It's the area under the curve that matters. Why? Because carbon has a very long lifetime, effectively 100 years in the atmosphere. So it's the total amount that builds up to the thickness of the blanket that matters. It's not what happens this year or that year, it's the whole amount. Well, it turns out that 75% of the area under the curve, 75% of cumulative emissions, were produced since the 1970s, since those companies made that decision. They were very successful. So what's new today? What's new today, and this is from the latest IPCC report, is that the warming that we are seeing is unprecedented in human history. And look at that. That's natural variability over the last 2,000 years, and then we just see this line going like this at the end. And it hasn't even caught up because there's a lag, there's a time lag. What else is new? Well, today, compared to 50 or 100 years ago, our heat-trapping gas emissions come from nearly every sector of the economy. Electricity, heat production, agriculture, forestry, buildings, transportation, industry, and other. We also know that quite literally, every ton of carbon we produce makes the problem worse. This is a figure that's showing observed warming, the black jagged line, but it's not showing observed warming against time. It's showing observed warming against carbon emissions, and not just annual, but cumulative carbon emissions. So what you see is that there's basically almost a linear relationship between temperature and cumulative carbon emissions. And what are these colored cones going into the future? These colored cones represent our choices. It's up to us how much carbon we choose to produce. And depending on how much we produce, here's how much warming we'll see. Oops. Heidi reacted to that. I thought I had this on. I do have this on. Focus doesn't work on Teams. What else do we see today? We also see that we're experiencing the impacts personally. So back in the 1980s, you were hard-pressed to put your finger on a way that climate change was affecting you. If I had asked the same question to people back 30, 40 years ago that I asked you at the beginning, I don't think I would have gotten so many answers. I probably would have gotten heat wave, summer, heat, temperature, heat wave. Because there was a really big heat wave in 1988. That's when Jim Hansen from NASA testified to Congress saying global warming was real. And then the IPCC report, the very first one, came out in 1990. But today, when I asked you, how do you see climate change affecting you, you saw all the answers we got. We got dozens of answers. That's because we can see the impacts right in front of our eyes. So since 1980, NOAA, in terms of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, has been tracking the number of weather and climate disasters that have caused at least $1 billion worth of damage. And you can see that I live in Texas, which is actually number one if you look at the numbers. Louisiana and Florida are also right up there because of all the hurricanes, and then there's California right there. And I highlighted California under here because you can see drought, 10 to 20 billion, no tropical cyclones. If California got hurricanes, it would right there is Texas. Flooding, 10 to 20 billion. Wildfire, 50 to 100 billion. Freeze, 10 to 20 billion. Severe storms, 2 to 5 billion. All disasters, 100 to 200 billion. How has this changed over time? Well, in the 1980s, when they started tracking this, there were, on average, one extreme weather or climate disaster causing at least $1 billion worth of 1980 equivalent dollars, because they've adjusted for how the value of the dollar's changed. At least one event every 4 months, somewhere in the U.S. So in the 1980s, one event every 4 months. Now, there's one event every 2.8 weeks. What does California look like? Look at that. In the 1980s, they only had 2 events in all the 1980s. So they had one every 5 years. One every 5 years compared to what have they seen the last couple of years? They have seen anywhere from 1 to 4, this actually goes off the chart, 1 to 4 a year. That's a huge difference, 1 every 5 years to, probably on average 2 a year. The way I think about it is, wherever we live, it's as if we have a pair of weather dice, and we always have a chance of rolling a double 6 naturally. There always were wildfires, there always were storms, there always were floods, there always were droughts. We know from historical records there have been mega droughts in California before, long before humans affected climate. But what's happening is as the world warms, it's like that climate change is sneaking in and taking one of these numbers and turning it into another 6. And then taking another number and turning it into another 6, and then people are like, hey, we just had 3 500-year flood events in 3 years? How could that be? And then it's taking some of the numbers and turning them into 7s or 8s. You're like, we've never had anything like this before. And that's exactly what's happening. We know that climate change is loading the weather dice against us. It's making droughts longer and more intense. It's making heat waves more frequent and more dangerous. It's causing wildfires to burn greater area. And it's making cyclones, hurricanes, typhoons, different name, same event. It's making them intensify faster and dump more rain. Now, how is climate change loading the weather dice against us with wildfires, right? In California, the vast majority of wildfires are accidental human ignition. Less than 10% are deliberate, and most are not natural. They're accidental. Like what? Well, like somebody, and these are real examples, dropping a load of burning trash into the dry brush. Or somebody plugging in an appliance in their shed and it sparks and starts a fire, burns down the shed, and then burns down the neighborhood. Or, infamously, somebody's letting off gender reveal fireworks in the middle of a drought. All those are ways that wildfires have started. So where's climate change? Climate change is not causing any of those ignitions. But here's the difference. Imagine that you have a pile of pretty green, wet wood, and you drop a match into it accidentally. What happens? Yeah, not much. It might smolder for a bit. Then imagine you have a pile of bone-dry kindling that has been baking in the sun for weeks with not a drop of rain on it, and you accidentally drop a match into it. What happens? Exactly. That's the difference between with or without climate change. And not only that, but climate change is also making atmospheric rivers stronger. You know these, they're rivers in the sky that go right across the Pacific, and then what happens when they hit the West Coast? They hit the mountains, and that air starts to rise, and as that air starts to rise, loaded with water vapor, as it rises, it gets cooler, and then it dumps all of the rain where? Here, exactly. So we're seeing that atmospheric rivers are getting stronger, and they don't just hit California, they hit the entire coast. In fact, a year and a half ago, British Columbia had a terrible flood from an atmospheric river as well. Never had a flood like this before. That was a pair of double 7s. And then what's also happening is we're seeing weather whiplash. So wherever we live, it's like, our weather goes hot, cold, wet, dry, like this, right? It's normal. But as the world gets warmer, it's stretching it in both directions. So here in California, this last fall and early winter, these are what the headline said. 4 in a row, drought likely continues. Driest 3 years ever recorded. No relief in sight. Current drought is the worst in 1,200 years. And then what happened in mid-January? Incredible flooding. And so then people are like, oh, well, what happened to the drought? Well, it turns out the drought is still there. So on the left is drought conditions before the torrential downpours and floods in mid-January. The darker red it is, the more in drought it is. And on the right is conditions now, as of today. And you can see that it ameliorated the drought, but it didn't get rid of it because the drought's so severe. So you just see us ricocheting back and forth between record warm and then record cold in the Northeast, record dry and then record wet here in California. And what else is new is that we are starting to be able to put numbers on how much worse climate change made it. We can actually calculate that 40% of the rain that fell during Hurricane Harvey was because of a warmer world. There's more water vapor in the atmosphere for that storm to sweep up and dump on us. Warmer oceans powered a stronger storm. The Pacific Northwest heat wave in June 2021, 150 times more likely because of climate change. We are calculating exactly the probabilities that climate change is putting on our dice. And we also know that even though it affects all of us, it doesn't affect us all equally. Climate change disproportionately affects women and children, especially in low-income countries. It disproportionately affects indigenous peoples, and it disproportionately affects Black and brown communities. Let me give you an example from Texas. In February 2021, we had a terrible ice storm, and we actually had a terrible one just this past week as well. And it took out power across the state. So first of all, there was massive price gouging. Some people had power bills in the thousands, which a lot of people couldn't afford to pay. People who lived in uninsulated homes with broken windows that couldn't afford generators. When their power went out, they were literally trying to run the oven to keep warm. And then when they started to put the power back on, which neighborhoods do you think got the power back on first? And which got back on last? There were very clear socioeconomic and racial disparities in who got the power back on first versus last. So whenever we see these disasters, they do affect us all, but they don't affect us all equally or the same. And that's not fair. So there's a lot of people who tell the stories of these disasters. I have a class I'm teaching right now for my graduate students where they're all required to read a book about one of these disasters. You can read about the Paradise Wildfires. You can read about Hurricane Katrina or Superstorm Sandy, about the impact it had on people both immediately and in the aftermath. Something I learned not too long ago that really surprised me was that even though the costs of these events are in the billions of dollars, the immediate costs of what's damaged during that week, those few days, are only 10% of the long-term costs. There are some counties in Oklahoma and Texas where you can still see the economic impact of the 1930s Dust Bowl. So there's this big hit, and then there's this long tail. So when we're talking billions of dollars, like $100 to $200 billion for California, you actually have to put an extra zero on the end of that to get the full cost. That's $1 to $2 trillion. And why do we care about these? We care about them because they affect things that are necessary to us to live. These disasters and a warming planet and rising CO2 levels, they affect the food that we all depend on to eat. They affect the water that we drink. They affect the air that we breathe. 10 million people around the world die every year from breathing in pollution from burning fossil fuels. They affect the buildings and roads and systems we use that were built for a planet that no longer exists. They affect the nature that surrounds us and the resources it provides. The bottom line is climate change is an everything issue. It affects our infrastructure, our economy, our energy, our water, our natural resources, and our food. It affects our health, our biodiversity. It affects political conflict. How much of it is resource-based? A lot. And it is a justice and an equity issue. We can't fix any of the problems that we have if we don't fix climate change. Climate change is not a standalone problem. Rather, it is a threat multiplier making everything else worse. The image I actually use of climate change is it's the hole in the bucket. Imagine that you're working to eradicate poverty. Climate change is the hole in the bucket. You're pouring everything you have into this bucket, all your time, all your effort, all the resources we have, and there's a hole in the bucket that's getting bigger and bigger. What do you have to do? You have to patch the hole so you can address poverty. Imagine you're addressing inequity. Imagine you're addressing hunger. Imagine you're addressing basic health care needs or basic education for girls. Whatever we're addressing, climate change is the hole in the bucket, and that's why it matters. So, can we tell this story? You bet we can. There's a really great series called The Years of Living Dangerously, and it tells this story. It goes all over America and then increasingly around the world to talk to the families who've been impacted by Superstorm Sandy, by drought in Texas, by changes in Greenland and how it's affecting people who live there. This tells the human story of why these changes matter to us. So, let me ask you a quick question. Some people got ahead of me here. Just checking in with you, making sure you're tracking. Still here. Which of these four that I've showed you so far, which of these four stories are you most interested in watching? Carbon, the flow of carbon through the Earth's climate system. The story of Mrs. Eunice Foote, a pioneering woman scientist. Merchants of Doubt, showing what the oil and gas industry did to delay climate action to sell as much oil and gas and coal as they could. Or the Years of Living Dangerously, that puts a human face on how does climate change affect us here and now in the places where we live. All right. I mean, Merchants of Doubt is edging ahead, no surprise. Merchants of Doubt is like a real-life drama. Like, you won't believe it's real, but you're watching and you're like, is this real? And then you Google it and you're like, yeah, it's real. They actually did this, actually said this. But I love that carbon's catching up. That's great. Eunice is super short. You can watch that very quickly. And The Years of Living Dangerously, it's a series, so you can pick whichever episode you're most interested in depending on what story it's telling. And these are actually great to use in class as well. All right. I'm glad to see you were paying attention. Onwards. We have more stories to tell. So given all of this, we often think, and this is actually an image from my little YouTube series called Global Weirding, we often think if they just knew the facts, surely they'd change their minds, right? I mean, this is bad. It is unprecedented. It is documented with 200 years of science. We've shown that there's cover-ups involved. It's affecting every aspect of human life on this planet. What more is there to say and know? There's a movie about that. This movie, if you have not seen it, it is fictional and it is a comedy, but it tells the stories of two scientists who see that there's an asteroid that is coming for the Earth. And they try to warn people about it. And they have images of the asteroid. They have satellite pictures. They have telescope pictures. Pretty soon people can see it with their own eyes. And they still aren't doing anything about it. I identify very much with this movie because my first job as an undergraduate was the opening scenes of this movie. The main character, Kate, is a graduate student. She's sitting in a telescope dome taking observations at night, and that is exactly my summer job. So how did this work out? Who's seen this movie? You people? Okay. So did everybody say, oh yes, oh wise scientists, you are right. You saw the comet. I can actually see it myself. We'll completely change our ways and we'll fix it. Is that what happened? No, that's not what happened. And that's because more facts don't necessarily fix the problem. Our assumption is that this is what people look like. There's me and most of the people I know, maybe not everyone, but most of the people I know who are worried. And then there's everybody else who is not worried and they don't want to talk about it. And if this is really the situation, then what do you need to do? You need to make people worried. What do you do to make people worried? You tell them all the scary things that are going to happen, right? Well, here's the thing. When you look at polling data and when you look at neuroscience, put both of those together, and more scary data isn't the answer. Let's take a look at the neuroscience first. So climate changes, and we get worried. And if we think I'm worried but nobody else is, what do? We share more scary data. You better be worried. But what we see happening is what happened in the movie Don't Look Up. People reject it even more. They don't want to talk about it even more. And so inaction results. Why is this? Well, Kelly Sherrod is a neuroscientist. She wrote a really good book called The Influential Mind. And it doesn't say anything about climate change, but in a way the whole book is about climate change, or it's about how we react to information. And in it she says, just from a neurological perspective, in general as humans, fear and anxiety will cause us to withdraw, to freeze, to give up rather than take action. Sound familiar? And so climate just changes more. So that's the neuroscience that shows why more scary data isn't going to help. But what does the polling data show? The The polling data shows that this is not actually what the population looks like here in the US or even around the world. Here's what we really look like. It turns out there's a very small group of people who say they're not worried, but in my opinion, I think they're actually worried deep down, they're just denying it. Denial is a reaction to not wanting to fix the problem. Then there is a vast majority of people who are worried. In the United States, over 70% of people are worried, over 80% of mothers are worried, over 85% of young people are worried. That is a huge amount of worried people. But you know how many people are activated? 8%. 8% are activated. So which is more important, to move the not worried into the worried group or to move the worried into the activated group? Exactly. Now let's put this together. If you've got a ton of people who are already worried, but they are, going back to here, withdrawn, frozen, and paralyzed, then what approach should we take? They don't need to be more worried. Cookies, that's a good one. And that actually is actually the answer because it's something positive for people to move forward towards. So just to refresh, most people are worried, and this is really sad. 50% of people in the U.S. feel hopeless and don't know where to start. So here's a clue. They're hopeless and they don't know where to start. So what do they need to know? Exactly. And where to start has nothing to do with melting ice sheets in Greenland. It has everything to do with where we are here and now. So the two biggest problems we have are not lack of information. It's that we haven't connected our head, which is very worried, to our heart, why it matters here and now. We're worried about the future, we're worried about the polar bears, we're worried about, civilization as we know it, but we have to understand why it matters here. And then the second part is we have to connect our heart to our hands. What are we supposed to do to fix it? We are all up here, tiny little bit down here, and only 8% have made it to the hands. So how do we do that? Well, the distance between the head and the heart is known as psychological distance. We know something is objectively true, but we haven't connected it to our lived experience. And we do this all the time. I mean, I'm not going to do a poll or ask for a show of hands, but who really stands up every 30 minutes throughout the whole day? Okay. Who really has never eaten something that they really shouldn't eat? We all do it, and we're like, oh, because the impact is far off in the future, if ever. And then the impact arrives. And, imagine if you had a heart attack from lack of exercise and poor diet, and they're coming to take you to the hospital to do, bypass surgery to save your life. And you're like, oh, no, don't take me to the hospital. I promise I'll join the gym. You're like, it is too late for that. So that's what we have to get over. We have to show people how it's not an issue that's distant in time or space. It's not like global average temperature. It's what happens here. And it's not something that just matters to tree huggers. It's something that matters to all of us. It matters a lot to tree huggers, but it matters to the rest of us also. I do like to hug trees, especially the really big ones. It's fun. But back to the point. How do I know this? I know this because the data tells me. So this is data from the Yale Program on Climate Communication. They asked people the same questions in every county around the U.S. Every little area is a county. And if more than 50% of people said yes, it's orange. And the darker orange it is, the more people said yes. If it's less than 50%, then it's blue. And the darker blue, the more people said no. So is global warming happening? And note that this was 3 years ago. They're going to update them soon, but they haven't quite yet. Yeah, it's happening. Is it going to harm plants and animals? Yes. Where's the psychological distance here? Non-human species. Distant in terms of relevance. Is it going to harm future generations? Where's the distance here? Future, not now. Is it going to harm people in developing countries? Where's the distance here? Spatial, over there, not here. And then they ask people this question. Do you think it will harm you? So this is psychological distance. And when we talk about this issue, we have to talk about the fact that it's now, not the future. It's here, not over there. It's concrete, and you all did a great job of that, talking about how you see it happening in your life, and it's relevant to me. So here's where we switch. Here's where we have to tell our story. Here's where you have to tell your story. And how do you tell your story? Your story is unique. Because you have different lived experience, you have different interests, you have different passions, you have different skills than anybody else in this room. Who you are is different in some way from everybody in here, and that means you have a different story to tell. So how do you tell your story? Well, you don't have to talk about the ice sheets. You don't have to talk about the ocean currents. Talk about how climate change is affecting you and what we together can do to fix it. So a little while ago, I was talking to a group of people in Iowa, and they said, okay, that's fine, but I just need to know how to talk about the polar bears. And I said, you don't talk about the polar bears in Texas or Iowa or California. What do you talk about? Well, when I'm in Texas, I talk about cotton. And I talked to Jack, who says he hasn't had a decent year of rain since 2005. When I'm in California, you can certainly talk about the wildfires, or the floods, or the droughts, or the heat, or the sea level rise, or the atmospheric rivers. You get the picture, right? You've got a lot to talk about. People in Vancouver can talk about the floods and the wildfires. People in Atlanta can talk about the air pollution, and believe me, people in LA can also talk about the air pollution. To care about climate change, you don't have to be a certain type of person. You just have to be a human being living on planet Earth. Tell your story and, in my opinion, even more importantly, ask other people theirs. I have asked people their climate story who didn't think they cared about climate change, but I didn't ask them for their climate story. I said, how long have you lived here? What do you enjoy doing? What are you really into? How long have you been doing that for? Have you seen any changes? Oh, you have? Tell me more. And before they know it, they're telling me how their favorite fishing hole is choked with algae because of warmer temperatures and pollution, or how the ski season is incredibly variable, or how they can't take their kids outside to play because it's too hot in the summer and it used to be perfect. They're telling me their climate story. That's even better than me telling them mine. But there's a second piece to it. We have to talk about the hands, right? We got the heart now. But what about the hands? What do solutions look like? I love talking about what I do myself, but I also love talking about what I've heard other people are doing as individuals, as schools, as classes, as organizations, as Rotary or Lions clubs, as a bunch of people who walk their dogs together or play hockey together, as companies, as cities, as organizations and churches and communities. People are willing to change if they think that what they are going to do will make a difference. That's a word called efficacy. And right now, most people would answer no. How do we change that? By showing them that people can make a difference, that you do not have to be the President of the United States to catalyze change. And in fact, frankly, it seems like the President of the United States is harder to catalyze change. So I talk about what solutions look like. Solutions that stop carbon from going into the atmosphere, like clean energy and efficiency and geothermal power and heat pumps. Solutions that take carbon out of the atmosphere, like smart farming and protecting and caring for our forests and grasslands and ecosystems. Solutions that help communities, like greening low-income neighborhoods. Did you know that low-income neighborhoods can be up to 15 degrees Fahrenheit hotter than high-income neighborhoods in the same city? And those of you in the impact class are nodding, because you learned that. And so when you green a low-income neighborhood, you are providing tree canopy that cools it off during a heat wave. That's benefit number one. What else do trees do? They filter the air, clean up the air pollution. Number two, they provide green space for people to take their families outdoors, which benefits their mental health. Number three, that green spaces also soak up the water when it rains, preventing floods. Number four, and then when things grow, they take up carbon from the atmosphere. Number five, those are some win-win-wins. And we can do that around the world. Mangrove forests protect coastlines from storm surge. They provide habitat for aquatic ecosystems and fish. They provide sources of firewood for local villages. There's all kinds of amazing solutions, and I love Project Drawdown. I know some of you have heard of that, some of you are learning about it. Project Drawdown tells stories about 100 different climate solutions, and a great way to talk to somebody, because we're all curious people, is to say, hey, did you know? Did you know? And read something about health and education and how education of women and girls is a climate solution. Did you know that? How does that work? How about heat pumps? Have you heard about heat pumps? That's a great way to save money heating and cooling your home. What about improved cook stoves? What about electric trains? I love telling stories about climate action that also gives us cleaner air and water, that also protects us from disasters like storms and wildfires and floods, that also improves our physical and mental health, that also provides more affordable energy, that also reduces inequalities, that also creates healthy ecosystems and foodscapes, that also gives us a more stable world, and oh, it helps with climate change too. These are the types of solutions that inspire us. We need hope, not a false hope that says, well, everything will be okay. It won't be okay if we don't do something about it. But a hope that says, there's a big risk. What's at stake is the future of human civilization as we know it. Success is not inevitable or even entirely probable, but there is a better future possible, and if we do everything we can make it. That's what hope is. And here's what the neuroscience has to say about this approach. Remember this, climate changes and you get worried. Now what do? You share how climate change affects us, the heart, and what solutions look like that are positive and constructive with multiple benefits today and tomorrow, the hands. And what happens is people feel empowered, and that's when action results. And here's what the neuroscience says about it. This is, again, Tali Surratt from The Influential Mind. She says, the human brain is built to associate forward action with a reward, like you said, cookies, but better than cookies, a better world, not with avoiding harm. So, and I promise you she's not talking about climate change here. She's just talking about our brains. Reframe your message so the information you provide induces hope, not dread. This is how our brains are wired to work. And in the words of Greta Thunberg, she says the one thing we need more than hope is action, because once we start to act, hope is everywhere. There's an intimate connection between knowing what to do and having that hope for a better future, because hope is based on action. And you know what? There is a movie about that. There's a really cool movie that this guy called Damon made in Australia called 2040, where he envisioned what Australia would look like. Not the world, not the Arctic, but Australia, if we enacted climate solutions. And he took it on the road to little communities all over Australia that had like the one little movie theater, and he showed it, and everybody came from the community, and they're like, oh my gosh, I want to live in that world. And he's like, all right, let's talk about what your community has to do to get to that world. And this vision of a better future sparked hopeful discussions all around Australia about what that path to a better future looked like and how they together in that town, that community, that city could do everything they could to get there. That is the power of telling a story. You can paint that better future and you can show people what it looks like, and that gives us the real genuine hope that we need to do everything we can to get there. So where do we start? Where do we start? We start by doing something so simple that we often skip right over this step. Let me take you back to the maps. Remember, this is the number of people who say global warming is happening, and then this is the number of people who think it will harm them personally. But there's one more map that's darker blue, and that map shows what we're not doing, what we're skipping right over, what we're completely neglecting. Often when I say what's the first thing we have to do, people are like, oh, reduce your carbon emissions, get an EV, even join a community organization. Those are all great things to do, but there's one precursor step that is so simple that we often just neglect it. And this next map shows what it is. They asked people, do you ever talk about it or even hear somebody else talk about it once in a while? And here's the connection. Yeah, LA is blue. Here's the connection. If you don't talk about it, why would you care? And if you don't care, why would you ever do anything about it? So how do humans do anything together without talking? Why don't we? Well, everybody I know is already worried. Is the goal of the conversation to make people more worried? It's to move them from worried to activated. They don't care about it like I do. Well, that's because nobody's helped them connect their head to their heart. There's nothing we can do about it. That's because nobody's told them about all the solutions that are happening, connected their heart to their hands. These are the exact reasons why we need to have conversations. The excuses we use about why not to are actually the reasons why to. And so as George Marshall says, he wrote a really good book about how our brains are wired to ignore climate change. He says, talk is the fertile field in which cultural change begins. In its absence, it's impossible for a group of people to solve a problem. How do people work together without talking? And he goes on, he says, the goal is not to tell people about it. The goal is to bring them in. And that's what that movie 2040 did. It brought people into the conversation of what a better future would look like. Talking is not sufficient. If you sit around and talk, it's not going to fix the problem. But talking is necessary as the first step. I think of it as knocking over the first domino. How has any change ever happened without it being catalyzed by somebody just opening their mouth and saying, hey, I think we should do this, or have you thought about this, or I'm worried about this, or they're doing that, why don't we do it too, or we could do it even better? That is how change happens. Talk about how climate change affects us and what we can do to fix it. All right, so we're wrapping up here, and then you're going to be able to ask me your questions, but I just want to take you through like the details on this for a second, all right? How is climate change affecting us? So what I do, and in my book I take you through this, is I do an inventory. Do an inventory on what's in your heart. So I'm a mom, and, you know, those of you who have kids, you know, when you first see that screaming red-faced bundle, you just feel like somebody reached into your chest and actually did something physical to your chest. You are never the same since, and you know you would do anything for that little tiny human, and even that giant human that they grow into. I live in Texas, which, as you know, is the most vulnerable state in the country to climate impacts. I'm Canadian, and Canada is warming twice as fast as the rest of the world. I love to ski, and you need snow to do that. And I'm a Christian, and I believe that we are to care for and love others. That's why I care. Now, it's your turn. Take out your phones. Now, I only want one word from you. Just one word, not two words. One word. And I don't want the same words. I want different words. Okay, fine. We all have one of those. Why do you care? Why do you care? Who are you that makes you care? What is your story that you can tell with people? We are each humans, and we can tell our human story. But we can also tell stories about how we are a student or a parent, a grandparent or a descendant. We can tell stories about how we love beer, or we're a teacher. Now that's good. You can tell lots of stories about beer or wine or beach vacations or kayaking or snorkeling. Tell stories about how you're a teacher and that's why you care. Or you're a vegetarian or you're a psychologist or you're an artist or you're a climber or you're a traveler. I love this. Look at all of these things. A cyclist, an astronomer, a sailor, an engineer, a kid, a genealogist. That's a really good one. A surfer, a warrior, yep. A person of faith, an indigenous. I love this. This is so perfect. This is your story. This is your story right here. I like how beer is getting it. I mean, okay, people, hello, wine? No wine? Why is there no wine here? I know. There's got to be a bit of wine, I'm sorry. You're really getting into this. This is great. So these are your stories. These are the stories you can tell. I am not a beer lover. You are. You can tell the beer story. I am not a lizard. You have, and I don't have a lizard, and I'm not going to have a lizard, but you do. You can tell that story. I am a sailor. I can definitely tell that story. Each of you has a story, and you can tell it. And that's how we connect the heart. But there's one more piece here, and that's what we can do to fix it. And that's where I love telling stories about what people are doing. I love telling stories about what countries are doing. I love telling stories about what businesses are doing. I like telling stories about what communities are doing. Army bases, churches, community centers. I love telling stories about what young people are doing. I love telling stories about how my own life is changing. I like telling stories about how the world is changing. I like telling stories so much I have a newsletter. And if you want to take a picture of this QR code, you can sign up for the newsletter. And every week you get a good news story about how the world is changing. You get a not so good news story about what's at risk. And you get something about what you can do to make a difference. This is all to aid in these conversations because people are like, what am I supposed to talk about? I'm like, I will give you every week 3 talking points to talk about. And you can make your own too. The bottom line is the boulder of climate action is not sitting at the bottom of an impossibly steep cliff. It is already at the top of the cliff, and it's rolling down the hill in the right direction, and it's got millions of hands on it, and if you add yours, it will go faster. So the only question I have at this point is, what are we waiting for? Because it isn't about saving the planet. The planet will be orbiting the sun long after we're gone. It is about saving us. And that is why I called my book, Saving Us. Thank you. So we have some time for questions, so about 10 minutes for questions. If you have to leave, go ahead and leave now. If you want to stay for 10 minutes for questions, stay on for 10 minutes of questions. And the way that we're doing questions is you can put in, it isn't one word anymore, you can put in as many words as you want. It has to end with a question mark. And here's the fun part, you can upvote the questions you most want me to answer. Won't be able to answer all the questions. If you're online, you can put your questions in here too. But help us out here and enter your question, if you have one, and give questions a thumbs up or a thumbs down if you want me to answer that question. The person asking what tool, well, this is a tool you already hear. So how do I deal with doomism and stay optimistic? 5 upvotes already. Here's the thing, bad news is everywhere, and it will find you. I did an experiment a couple of months ago where I went to the main page of a mainline news site, and there were 35 stories or headlines on this news site, and I counted how many were neutral. There were a fair amount that were neutral. How many made me feel anxious, afraid, frustrated, angry, or fearful? Quite a few. And how many made me feel positive, hopeful, or motivated? 0. For-profit news knows that if it bleeds, it leads. And so hope is not going to find us. So what I do is I go out and I look for hope. And when I look for it, I find it. And that's why I share in my newsletter and on my social media accounts. We have to practice hope like a muscle. And the more you practice it, the better you get at it. But you have to practice. You can't go out and just run a 10K. Well, maybe some of you can. I can't. From couch to 10K overnight. You got to practice hope. It is not going to find you, but if you go looking for it, you can find it. And then it is our role to share that information. And where do we find hope? In action. We find hope in connecting what's in our heads, all that fear and doomerism and all the accurate scientific knowledge that we have that tells us it's bad and it's going to get worse. Connect that to why we care in our hearts, and then connect it to our hands. How we, working together, can make a difference. And that's why conversations matter, because it isn't about individual action. It is about us working together to change the system. That's what this is about. How can we as scientists become better science communicators? Ooh, I love that that's risen to the top. I have to say that I was just out of my master's degree when I took my first media and science communication training course. I actually happened into it by accident. I was working on a project, and they decided to train everybody on the project. I was absolutely astonished. I had no idea that there was a complete science to this communication. I learned that you can have messages, and you can have talking points, and you can, respond to questions without repeating what they say to you, and you can actually get what you want to say across. You need to answer briefly. Don't go on 5 to 10 minute speeches. Get your points across clearly. And so with science communication, training and practice, criticism, asking how you could do better, and practicing again is absolutely essential. What you see before you here is 15 years of that. It did not come overnight. I did not just sort of spring into a podium one day and, communicate. I have committed almost every error that you can imagine in terms of poor communication. And I continue to mess up because nobody's perfect. But if you really have the heart for it, you really want to get better, and you seek out resources to learn more and to do more and to be better, you will get better. And that's what is most important, I think, about science communication is you understand it takes work and you want to put that work in. If you do that, you will get better. What careers could Mudd students pursue to help fight climate change? I love this question because my answer is quite literally anything. I have worked with people who have degrees in pretty much every field you can imagine. I work with people who have degrees in communication, marketing, and PR. I work with people who have degrees in psychology, sociology, and human geography. I work with people who have degrees in engineering and ecology and economics. I work with people who have degrees in political science, in physics and chemistry, in technical writing and English, and performing and visual art. People have degrees in medicine and law and architecture. Study whatever you love, whatever you are good at, and use that solid grounding of skills that you get here at the 5 colleges to then apply it to making a difference on climate change because we need everybody. What's the best thing for a student to do right now? I think you know the answer to that. You have a voice. Use your voice. There are 7-year-olds doing climate podcasts on YouTube. If they can do it, we can do it. And it's not necessarily about YouTube. It's about however you express your voice. And sometimes it isn't about actually saying something. So, for example, I'm a knitter. And one thing you can do is you can knit this warming stripe scarf with 1 row for every year. And it starts off blue in the 1800s where it was cool, and it gets red by now. So you wrap this scarf around your neck, or you can get flip-flops, or you can get leggings, and you can get a tie, or you can get all kinds of things with the warming stripes on it. You can get a mask. And then people are like, ooh, that's really pretty. What is that? Is it from Netflix? And you're like, no, it's the warming stripes. Let me explain to you what you're looking at. There's all kinds of ways that you can influence people without even opening your mouth. It's about communication. I talk about in my book how when I first got a plug-in car, I left it plugged in outside the house, and everybody's like, what is that? They were asking me. This was a while ago, okay? It was also in Texas. They were asking me what it was, and so I got to explain why it was an electric car and where I bought it and how much money I saved and why it was a great thing. So what are some of the most exciting solutions? I try to figure out what people like and then try to share something about that. So that's why I have my newsletter where I share all kinds of different solutions. Depending on what they're into, offering a solution that relates to something they care about is great. But also offering solutions that are happening in California, that are happening at businesses or organizations they might know, something that has a personal connection. And then lastly, this is the question that we'll end on. Well, actually, I'll touch briefly on the waste. We are very wasteful. And when you look at renewable energy, we have to figure out how to recycle our solar panels, we have to figure out how to recycle our wind turbines, and we have to really deeply invest in urban mining. Urban mining is really cool. It's actually taking all of our waste products and mining them. Did you know that there's like 10 times, the concentration of platinum in old cell phones is 10 times what it is in the best ore deposits in rock? So it's a lot more efficient to mine what we have than to go looking for more. But we do know that if we continue depending on fossil fuels, it will lead to the extinction of at least 30% of species on the face of the earth and very likely the end of human civilization as we know it. So we have to get off fossil fuels as soon as possible, but we need to do it in a way that truly leads to a circular economy because we live on a circular planet. But I'm going to end with this question because the question at the top is a really good question to end with. How does my background as a Christian impact my practice as a science communicator? It impacts it in all kinds of ways, beginning with the fact that the reason I'm a climate scientist is actually because I'm a Christian. I was planning to be an astrophysicist, just like Kate in the movie Don't Look Up. But when I took a class on climate change as a breadth requirement, as so many students here can do, which is phenomenal, that's where I discovered that climate change is not only an environmental issue, it's a human issue, and it affects every person on this planet, but it affects the poorest and most marginalized people the most. And that's not fair. And they are not the ones who often have the voice at the table, making the decisions, doing the science, leading the reports. And so that's when I decided that I personally needed to do whatever I could to help make a difference on this issue because it was not fair. So that's why I became a climate scientist. And then I was doing science to support policy decisions, and I started to get invited when I moved to Texas to speak to groups about climate change who had never really had a speaker on climate change before. And the first time I went, I committed probably all of the communication sins that you can possibly imagine. You know, overly complicated graphs, tiny font, too much detail, science, 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 nothing about the heart or the hands, all about the head. And really only a few brain cells in the head, too. To kind of look at very quantitative data. But because my heart was in the right place and because I wanted to communicate, I listened very carefully to the questions I got. Because I figured those were the questions that I didn't answer. And the questions were asking, well, what about volcanoes? What about this? You know, what about natural cycles? So I went back and researched, and the next time I got asked to speak, I talked about volcanoes and natural cycles and how we know it's humans. And then I started getting questions about, okay, but I understand about the polar bears. Why does it matter to me in Texas? So I started doing research. Why does it matter in Texas? Started talking about that. And then I started getting people asking, well, what are we supposed to do about it? So I started researching wind energy and efficiency and nature-based solutions. And then I started to get questions after about 10 or 12 times talking to, you know, the local Lions Club or the Senior Citizens seminar series or, you know, the Women's Book Club. I started to get questions about, well, why do you care? And for me, the reason that I am a climate scientist, like I said, is because it is a justice issue. And that is intimately linked to what I believe, to my faith. And so around about that time, I got my first invitation to speak to a church. They didn't know that I was a Christian because I'd never told anybody because you don't really talk about that as a scientist. And they didn't invite me to speak on Sunday, invited me to speak on Wednesday. Didn't invite me to speak in the sanctuary, invited me to speak in the Adult Bible Fellowship Hall. Wasn't invited to First Baptist, it was Second Baptist. Second Baptist can afford to be a little sort of loose with who they invite. Still have not been invited to speak at First Baptist, just for the record. But that was when I decided, as uncomfortable as it feels, and believe me, it felt very uncomfortable, I'm going to tell them why I care. And so I looked up some Bible verses, and I put them in the end of my presentation, and I was pretty nervous. I didn't know how it would go. But I went through how we know it's humans. I went through why it matters to Texas. I went through what solutions look like, and then I started to talk about why I cared. And it was a completely different experience in terms of how people related to me, because I had suddenly gone from here to here. And that taught me the importance of connecting over something that we share. And so when I'm talking to somebody or a group of people, I try to figure out, what do I have in common with them? Like, are we both really into skiing? Or are we both parents? Or, you know, have we had similar experiences? Or do we both work in the same industry? Or some point of connection to begin the conversation. And in my book, you'll find lots of stories. And probably one of the funniest and weirdest stories is how I connected with somebody who had previously blown up in my face, yelling at me, telling me that climate change wasn't real and how could I say that, and we didn't know. And then it turned out that we ended up connecting over a shared love of knitting. So what this taught me is that everybody has a reason to care, and it is not our job to force our reason on them. It is our job to figure out what reason that is and help them connect the dots between their head, their heart, and their hands. And we can do that through telling and sharing our own story with people and asking questions that encourage others to share their story with us.